Why does a nation of 7,000 islands depend entirely on its people leaving? 50 years ago, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. turned Filipino workers into an export product. Today, his son still runs the exact same machine. 3 simultaneous shocks are now testing whether it holds. The global pipeline that has insulated this country for decades is constricting. To understand how we got here, we need to look past the official rhetoric and find the quiet daily ritual that keeps the whole nation afloat. Act 1. The daily ritual. The architecture of this exodus is visible every single morning. A quiet ritual of economic survival, repeated across airports and ferry terminals from Luzon to Mindanao. Not an abstract theory, a lived reality for millions of families caught inside a system that has spent half a century perfecting the art of sending its talent away. Step into the pre-dawn humidity of the departure terminal at Mactan Cebu International Airport. The scene repeats every morning, year after year. Careful goodbyes over cheap luggage wrapped in plastic. Children clinging to parents about to board flights to Riyadh, Singapore, or Los Angeles. These are the overseas Filipino workers, the OFWs. They leave because they must, and their collective departure forms the literal backbone of the domestic economy. That departure creates an extraordinary financial cascade. In 2025, formal cash remittances hit an all-time high of $35.63 billion US dollars. Including informal transfers, the total reaches $39.62 billion US dollars. That is 7.3% of the entire gross domestic product. Every factory, every service, every good sold inside the country carries the fingerprint of someone who chose to leave. Compare the Philippines to the rest of Southeast Asia and the scale of this reliance becomes stark. Vietnam stands at 3.4% of gross domestic product. Cambodia sits at 6.1%. The Philippines towers above both at 8.2%. These annual inflows are more than double the entire volume of foreign portfolio investment flowing into the country's stocks and bonds. For a household in Cebu or Pampanga, $40 billion is not a number on a central bank spreadsheet. It is the monthly wire transfer that pays school tuition, covers the mortgage, and cushions the rising cost of rice. Remittances are the primary mechanism of survival for millions of Filipino families. And this entire structural foundation now faces 3 shocks arriving at exactly the same time. 3 severe disruptions are colliding in 2026. An aggressive US immigration enforcement campaign targeting an estimated 300,000 undocumented Filipinos. Escalating Middle East conflict putting approximately 2 million workers at risk near the Strait of Hormuz. And a new 1% US tax on outward remittances creating permanent friction on the primary corridor. The pipeline is constricting, and the blueprint behind it is starting to look like a prison. Act 2. The blueprint that became a prison. This exodus did not happen by accident. It was deliberately engineered as state policy. 5 decades ago, the Philippine government built an apparatus designed specifically to export its own citizens. To understand why the country is so exposed to these modern shocks, we have to trace that original pressure valve back to a moment of acute domestic crisis. The foundational blueprint was drawn in 1974. Facing a stagnant economy, soaring inflation, and dangerous unemployment under martial law, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. signed Presidential Decree 442, the Philippine Labor Code. The goal was direct: generate foreign exchange and ease social unrest. It was designed as a temporary emergency measure. Instead, it became a permanent national dependency. What began as an emergency framework quickly grew into a national recruitment machine. The state built the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration to manage deployment at scale. By 2023, the apparatus had been elevated into a full cabinet-level ministry, the Department of Migrant Workers. Each iteration simply built a larger institutional framework around the same aging strategy. For 5 decades, every administration in Manila has officially denied running a deliberate labor export policy. The historical record tells a different story. The original 1974 mandate explicitly instructed officials to promote overseas employment. When democracy was restored under Corazon Aquino in 1986, the system was expanded, not dismantled. Today, President Marcos Jr. lauds these workers as modern-day heroes, transforming a domestic policy failure into a national virtue. Over 50 years, the temporary patch has hardened into permanent national identity. More than 2 million workers are deployed annually across more than 190 countries. Remittances peaked at 12.8% of gross domestic product back in 2005. The absolute dependency has only deepened since. Today, that share sits at 8.2%, representing millions of empty chairs at dinner tables across the archipelago. Act 3. Who benefits and who pays? On a macroeconomic spreadsheet, the benefits of this model appear flawless. A reliable shield for the national accounts, absorbing external shocks, keeping the domestic market liquid. But that spreadsheet hides a devastating domestic price tag that the political elite in Manila has spent decades choosing not to calculate. Now, the shield is real. Billions in monthly inflows anchor the Philippine peso. They allow the central bank to accumulate substantial foreign exchange reserves. They drive consumer spending across shopping malls, real estate developments, and private schools. The consumption economy runs on remittance fuel, but the consumption model completely conceals a structural cost accumulating beneath the surface. The most devastating cost is the hollowing out of domestic healthcare. The Philippines is the planet's foremost exporter of nursing talent, yet its own citizens face a chronic shortage of medical care at home. The country currently has a domestic nurse deficit of at least 127,000 professionals. The doctor ratio has fallen to 7.92 per 10,000 people, well below the basic international standard of 10 per 10,000. The country that trains the world's nurses cannot staff its own rural clinics. That gap in the regional numbers represents something more than a statistic. It represents the distance between a government that invested in domestic jobs and one that decided it was easier to export the people who needed them. The Philippines, at 8.2% remittance dependency, built its economy on labor export and consumption. Vietnam, at 3.4%, built a domestic manufacturing base instead. Cambodia, at 6.1%, is actively courting foreign investment to reduce its own dependency. The Philippines chose a different path entirely. That choice lands hardest in the rural provinces. Outside Davao, a single rural physician can find herself serving a population of 200,000 people alone, a catchment area that requires at least 9 doctors under standard health guidelines. The economics make this structural. A qualified Filipino nurse earns 13 times more in the United States than in a domestic public hospital. Building more nursing schools does not solve the shortage. It simply expands the emigration pipeline. The migration architecture has also created an acute geographic concentration risk. More than half of all formal remittance inflows originate from just 3 countries. The United States accounts for 40% of the total. Singapore contributes 7.3%. Saudi Arabia adds 6.6%. Behind this structural vulnerability sits a powerful private industry of recruitment agencies, training centers, and remittance companies that profits from every worker who leaves and actively lobbies to keep the pipeline flowing. Act 4. 3 threats arriving simultaneously. This 50-year-old system is now facing its toughest historical test. For decades, geographic dispersion across 190 countries was seen as a strategic advantage, a diversified buffer against any single disruption. Today, as 3 distinct shocks arrive at the same time, that diversification is revealing itself as a vulnerability. The system was built to be resilient against isolated shocks. It was never designed for simultaneous ones. The first shock is the sudden policy pivot in Washington. The United States is the primary artery of the entire system, accounting for over $14 billion in annual remittances. An aggressive deportation campaign, targeting 300,000 undocumented Filipinos, puts that entire corridor at risk. Even before any deportation, the psychological pressure is real. Reduced working hours, job insecurity, cash hoarding. That compression is already rippling through retail consumption across the Philippines. Simultaneously, escalating conflict in the Middle East puts approximately 2 million workers at risk across the Gulf states. The Department of Migrant Workers has already drafted emergency evacuation plans. This corridor has always carried physical danger. Manila previously suspended deployments to Kuwait after the murder of a Filipino domestic worker in January 2023. The Gulf remains indispensable for millions of working-class Filipino families, and it remains dangerous. The third shock is structural rather than geopolitical. A new 1% US tax on all outward remittances took effect in 2026. The policy deadline triggered a frantic surge of transfers in December 2025 as families rushed to move money before the cut. That surge was a one-time relief. The long-term reality is permanent friction on the primary artery of the entire system, reducing the volume of capital flowing home month after month. When these shocks collide, the consequence chain descends fast. A Gulf hospital cuts foreign staff. The monthly wire transfer stops. The domestic cascade is immediate. The mortgage goes unpaid. A child is pulled from university. Household spending drops to survival level. The Philippine state has spent half a century treating these families as self-funded safety nets. No government support system exists to catch them when the overseas income disappears. Act 5. The trap that works too well. The real tragedy of the Philippine model is that it has been far too successful to force internal reform. Remittance inflows have functioned as a financial narcotic. Billions arrive every month. Politicians face no existential pressure to rebuild the core economic foundations. The system insulates the elite from the consequences of their own failures, and the families paying the human cost are too dispersed, too grateful, and too dependent to organize against it. The mechanics are consistent across 5 administrations. Whenever unemployment became politically dangerous, the government opened the valve and exported the surplus. Broken education, dysfunctional infrastructure, the complete absence of a competitive manufacturing base, all left unaddressed. The result is an economy entirely powered by spending rather than making, resilient enough during normal times, structurally exposed the moment the global pipeline tightens. Viewed through a regional lens, the danger becomes clearer still. Vietnam offers the sharpest contrast. Emerging from conflict at roughly the same moment the Philippine Labor Code was enacted, Hanoi directed state policy toward building a domestic industrial export base. Today, Vietnam's remittance share sits at 3.4% of gross domestic product. Cambodia, at 6.1%, is actively courting foreign manufacturing investment to reduce its own dependency. Both countries are building something at home. The Philippines keeps sending its builders away. That is what brings 5 decades of state policy to this crossroads. President Marcos Jr. now presides over the exact machine his father constructed. He calls these workers heroes. The glorification is sincere. It is also convenient, because celebrating migration as a national triumph makes it much harder to ask the harder question. The state has perfected a mechanism that exports the exact qualities a developing nation needs most: the drive, the ambition, the willingness to work. The Philippines has spent half a century perfecting the art of sending its people away. The harder question, the one no government has wanted to answer, is what happens to the country you build in their absence. I am Hero the Hornbill, and this is the ASEAN Angle. If this episode gave you a new way of seeing the region, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. New episodes weekly, link in the description.